Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner, and today I'm coming to you from inside a Puritan church in New England because we're going to read something a little unusual today. We're going to take a look at a sermon. Now, this is a sermon that appears in literature books all across North America, and we're not going to be reading it as a religious text. We're going to be taking a look at it as an influential early piece of American literature. So let's get started. All right, so here we are. The piece we're going to be taking a look at today, as I said, is a sermon, and it's generally been titled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And you'll notice here that on the screen it says from Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which means we're reading just an excerpt of it. Certainly a full-length Puritan sermon at the time would have been longer than what we have. We're not looking at this as a piece of religious text, but we're looking at it as a very important contribution to American lit. And early pieces from this time, whether it be music or poetry or literature or something, they often do have religious overtones because the church at the time, regardless of the type of church and the nation that you're speaking of, they were sort of entwined. And the church is where a lot of education and action and money and initiative and things like that came from. Now, Jonathan Edwards is he's someone who believed that the church was sort of losing its way, and he wanted to bring people back. And one of the ways he did this, quite frankly, was to scare people that if you want to live, if you want to survive, if you don't want to go into the pits of hell, you better, open your ears and listen to me now, because that's what we're talking about. Right? So the lesson essential question that we have is, how does the author use emphasis and analogy to compose a fiery New England sermon? And the fiery part of this is going to be pretty obvious, but emphasis is really important. So essentially, sermons are speeches. And we're going to do a number of speeches throughout this course, and you've probably done them in other English classes already. One of the things about a speech is it goes on whether you're paying attention or not. And so if I read something, if I read an essay and there's a particular point I come across and I don't quite get it, I can pause and think about it. Or I could turn back a few pages and reread what I had just read, hoping to get a little bit more information out of it. But when it comes to a speech, the speech goes on. And if I stop to think, I now miss everything from that point on. So it's really important in a speech to emphasize the most important parts. And there are a number of techniques that can be used to create emphasis. The other thing that we've got here is analogy. How do we help people to understand a concept which is new or foreign or unique to them? And you do it by finding something that they understand, something that they can experience, and then you draw a relationship between the experience they understand and the one that you're trying to describe them to them or introduce them to. And that's called an analogy. And there are different types of analogies, but today we're just focusing on the broad term. I don't have a whole lot of biographical information for you here about Jonathan Edwards, but you can see he lived in the 18th century. So he's born after 1700, dies before the American Revolution gets started. He's born in Connecticut. So we are in New England. New England was settled largely by Puritans, and then Quakers and others came along too, looking for religious freedom. He was admitted to Yale College at age 13. Now, that sounds incredibly young to us today. That was about 2 years early back at that point. It was not that uncommon to start college at age 15 in those days. And he studied theology. Pretty much all of the universities, all the colleges that we had started out as religious institutions. And so you would have a lot of people going there to study God and the way people approach God and the particular religion that you may be teaching later on. And he comes from a line of ministers. So his father was a minister, his grandfather was a minister. But one of the things, as I alluded to before we started the slideshow, is that he felt like the church was sort of losing its way and he wanted to bring people back. And so one of his things was to make getting religion exciting, to make it a participatory kind of thing, not just sit and listen, but to think and be involved. And he did this by making his sermons emotional and, to be perfectly honest, downright terrifying, as you'll see in this one. And he started something which later became known as the Great Awakening. It was one of the first religious revival movements in the United States. What would happen during the Great Awakening movement is preachers would travel on a circuit, bring people out for a few days on end, preach and study and preach and study, and try to wake people up to the idea of a God being around them. And they need to be very, very careful if they don't want to end up in hell one day, even though he kind of says they don't have any kind of power over that anyway. And then, the church, for whatever reason, maybe he was too successful, but the church eventually kind of dismissed him, sent him away, said he no longer had a right to preach on their behalf. And at that point, he went off and he decided to become a missionary and try to convert some of the American Indians at the time. He was a president of Princeton University as well. Now, an interesting kind of thing, if you are a Hamilton fan, and I know that I get fans of Hamilton the musical in here, you know that there's a part in Hamilton where Aaron Burr, who's vice president of the US, the one who shoots Alexander Hamilton, he says, "My grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher." I think it says something like, but there are things that the homilies and hymns don't teach you. But anyway, this guy right here in front of you, Jonathan Edwards, was the grandfather to Aaron Burr, who later shot Alexander Hamilton. So there's a little bit of a connection there. Now, this particular piece that we have, what we do know about it isn't everything, obviously, but we know that it was delivered in Enfield, Connecticut on July 8th, 1741. But we believe that it was delivered before that as well, that he had delivered it and then he was kind of invited here to deliver it. And this is when it's going to be printed for the first time, set down on paper. So we don't actually have a printed version of the original version that we have. People said at the time that even though we're going to read this today and it's going to feel very loud and angry and fiery, people said at the time that Jonathan Edwards had a very quiet way. And sometimes when there's a sort of disconnect between the tone of your voice and the message, it becomes more powerful. So if I'm very, very excited and I'm screaming and yelling in an excited way, you know I'm excited. But sometimes when something's terrifying and you just slow down and you just discuss the terrible, awful death that is ahead of you, it can seem even more terrifying. All right. And so we have the text of this 80 years later, it became made available to the public. Whether it was completely what Jonathan Edwards had delivered or whether it was what people remembered he had delivered, I've read different things on it. But this version that we have is the version which is studied all across America in American Lit classes. So it's a very famous piece of early American literature. The literary terms that you're going to focus on here, we talked a little bit about analogy. So analogy is when you try to get somebody to understand something new by comparing it to something similar that they already know, and then sort of making a connection through those similarities. And there are different types of analogies. So similes. Similes are, like and as. He acts like a mean old buzzard would be a simile. You have metaphors, which are more direct. They do the same thing, but they don't have the like or as. So that man is a mean old buzzard. And of course, we understand we mean that figuratively. He's not actually a mean old buzzard, or he wouldn't be a man, he'd be a bird, right? So it's an indirect, but it's more direct than a simile is. And there are other types too that we'll talk about as the course goes on. Emphasis, again, is putting extra weight on certain points or topics. Repetition is probably one of the most common ways to do this in a speech. There are other vocal techniques like pausing or getting louder to drive home a point. But repetition of a point tends to be most common in a speech. And it's kind of helpful because people are sometimes like, what did he say? Oh, he said it again, kind of thing. So repetition works very, very well. All right, so you're not going to take a look at the video right now. If you meet with me in class, I sometimes show this 7-minute video, which kind of talks about Protestantism in America and introduces you a little bit to Jonathan Edwards. But what you're going to do now is you're going to pause this video in a moment. You're going to go read the piece. It's all of about a page and a half long, so it's not going to take that long to read. I want you to look at the language techniques. Look at how the word choices and the sentence structures affect the emotional tone of this piece. Look for analogies, a lot of similes, but you're trying to get people to understand what the fiery pits of hell must be like and how God looks at people and understand that relationship and how great that must be, if the belief is that God is infinite and people are finite. What is the difference between infinite and finite, right? It's infinite. And so that's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around. So look at the techniques he uses to kind of drive that point home. And then if you can, imagine, step aside here, imagine, this church is full of people and they're hearing the speech as you're reading it. Try to imagine how you think they'd be reacting to it. All right, again, stop the video right now. Don't go on. You're going to pause this. You're going to go read the piece, and then you're going to come out, and we'll go on. So I'm going to wait right here, and you tell me when you're ready to go on. You ready to go on? You're sure? You're sure you read the piece? All right, let's go on then. All right, let's just check out a couple things. We discussed this if you were in class. Can you sympathize with the members of the congregation? They came out weeping. They were terrified of what was going to happen to them, and they wanted to make a sudden change in their lives before it was too late. But let's take a look at the check for understanding questions. First one says, who were the only people in the audience who, according to Edwards, might be spared God's wrath? And that would be people who had experienced an awakening, people who realized, oh my gosh, I have to listen to what this man is saying and I have to take action now. There's a little bit of a conundrum here because he says to his congregation, there's nothing you can do in order to kind of get into heaven and avoid the fiery pits of hell. That's up to, God. But the same side is if you're awakened to this idea and you watch your life, it certainly can't hurt, right? You can't do it on your own, but it certainly can't hurt to try. All right, what about this? One of the themes, that should say themes, it says one theme of Edward's sermon is what? And that's what we just talked about. There's nothing that a person can do to save himself or herself from hell. But again, the whole message here is it can't hurt to try, right? You probably want to. This one here shows kind of like the angry God perspective that Edwards takes on this. Which of the following sums up Edwards' view of the earth's attitude towards people? And I kind of agree with this, even as an environmentalist myself, but people are a burden to it. The earth might do better without all of us. And so it doesn't need us here to go on. All right, how about this? Edwards warns that destruction comes to people suddenly and when they least expect it, disguised as a friend, slowly and painfully, or at night as they lay sleeping. That sounds like some kind of a snake. Yeah, it's suddenly and when you least expect it. So his point that he's driving home is people are often like, yeah, I know I'm doing terrible things in my life now, but I'll fix it one day. And his point is you may not have a one day, right? It comes for you. Death comes to you when you're not expecting it. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to fill in the blank here. So we have a line from the, I have to move myself out of the way here. It says, the earth does not willingly yield her increase to satisfy your lust, nor is it willingly a stage for your wickedness to be acted upon. The air does not willingly serve you for breath. It illustrates the use of repetition for what? Which one of these techniques is being used here? Right. And we get that with the she. We get the earth does not satisfy, nor is it willing. If the earth is willing, we're giving it personification here. So that's pretty clear. How about this one? The literary technique demonstrated in this one. Your destruction would come like a whirlwind. That key is in that word like. And of course, that would be a simile then. And then finally, point of view. So this is interesting. We know there's first person point of view, second person point of view, and third person point of view. First person is often used. We like to talk about ourselves. Many novels are narrated by the main character. We get third person very often. That's the he, she. Many times we have stories told about other people. Second person doesn't get used very often because second person is you. But in this particular sermon, that's exactly what he's talking about. You had better do these things. You had better listen now. You have to understand. All right, so that's our quick overview of Jonathan Edwards and Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Again, we're looking at it as a piece of American lit. It was influential. It created an entire movement. And to be quite frankly, we're at a period of time where people are not publishing books in America for money. It's not a career yet. So the documents we're looking at are kind of dry, you know, but we'll move on. We got better stuff coming up. All right, if you stayed with me to the end, thank you. Be safe, and I'll see you in class.